Imagine waking up in a pristine white room, facing two identical doors. Behind one lies eternal happiness. Behind the other, eternal suffering. A mysterious voice tells you that you must choose, but there's a twist. You can only open the door that leads to suffering. If you try to open the door to happiness, both doors will lead to eternal torment. Your heart pounds as you realize this isn't just a choice. It's a trap that challenges the very nature of free will and destiny. This is the eternal choice paradox, a mind-bending puzzle that has haunted philosophers and thinkers throughout time. It's not just about doors or choices. It's about the fundamental nature of freedom, decision-making, and the limits of human agency. As we explore this paradox together, you'll discover that it touches the deepest questions about existence itself. Let's carefully unravel this philosophical maze. If you choose the door to suffering, accepting your fate, are you truly choosing? And if you attempt to choose happiness, knowing it leads to suffering, isn't that a form of self-deception? The paradox creates a loop where every attempt to exercise free will seem to negate itself. Consider the implications. If you cannot freely choose happiness, is it really a choice at all? The voice's conditions seem to eliminate the possibility of genuine choice while simultaneously demanding that you make one. It's like being told to draw a square circle. The very concept contradicts itself. This paradox mirrors real-world situations where our choices are constrained by circumstances beyond our control. Think about decisions in your own life. How often are they truly free? When societal pressures, personal limitations, and external conditions shape our options, what remains of genuine free will? The eternal choice. Paradox also reveals something profound about human nature. Even when faced with inevitable suffering, we struggle against it. We search for loopholes, alternatives, ways to outsmart the system. This resistance to predetermined fate seems woven into our very being. Some philosophers argue that the paradox exposes the illusion of free will entirely. If our choices are always constrained by conditions we didn't choose, perhaps freedom is merely a comforting myth. Others contend that true freedom lies in how we respond to constraints, not in the absence of them. As you ponder this paradox, consider its parallels in everyday life. When facing difficult decisions, we often find ourselves trapped between equally uncomfortable options. The illusion of choice masks the reality that sometimes all paths lead to challenge or change. The eternal choice. Paradox teaches us that sometimes the most significant insights come not from finding solutions, but from understanding why certain questions resist answers. It's not just about doors or decisions. It's about the nature of human consciousness, the limits of free will, and the complex relationship between choice and destiny. Throughout this journey into the world of paradoxes, we'll encounter many such puzzles that challenge our assumptions and expand our understanding. Each one offers a unique window into the nature of reality, consciousness, and human experience. They remind us that the deepest truths often lie in questions that cannot be easily answered. So, as you drift into contemplation, remember the white room, the two doors, and the impossible choice. Let it be your gateway into a realm where logic meets mystery, where certainty dissolves into question, and where the boundaries of human understanding are constantly challenged and redefined. The complexities of choice extend far beyond our theoretical white room. Consider a seemingly simpler scenario. A person stands at the edge of time itself, holding a photograph of their own birth. They travel back in time and become the photographer who took that very picture. Who originally took the photograph? Where did the image truly originate? This is the photograph paradox, a puzzle that challenges our understanding of causality and origin. In this temporal loop, the photograph exists without ever having been truly created. It's caught in an endless cycle of self-fulfillment, where effect becomes cause, and cause becomes effect. Each iteration of the cycle depends on previous iterations that themselves depend on future ones. The photograph exists because it was taken, because it existed, because it was taken. An infinite regression that defies our linear understanding of time. But the photograph paradox isn't just about time travel. It reveals something profound about the nature of information and creation itself. Think about ideas, stories, or traditions that seem to have always existed, passed down through generations. Can we truly pinpoint their origins, or do they exist in a kind of cultural loop, each generation inheriting and reinventing them simultaneously? This paradox forces us to question our assumptions about originality and creativity. When an artist creates something new, are they truly creating from nothing? Or are they participating in an endless cycle of influence and inspiration? Every creation builds on what came before, yet somehow new things emerge. It's a dance between past and future, between influence and innovation. The implications stretch into the realm of identity and consciousness. Our memories shape who we are, but those memories are constantly being reshaped by who we become. Like the photograph in our paradox, our sense of self exists in a loop where past and present continuously influence each other. We are both the photographers and the subjects of our own life stories. Consider how this applies to knowledge itself. Every understanding we have builds on previous understanding, yet those foundational concepts often only make sense in light of what they help explain. Mathematics, for instance, uses numbers to explain reality, yet numbers themselves are abstractions we created to make sense of that reality. The circle of understanding spins endlessly, like our time-traveling photographer. The photograph paradox also illuminates questions about determinism and free will. In a universe where effects can be their own causes, what room is there for genuine choice? If our actions are part of a predetermined loop, are we truly making decisions or simply playing out roles in an already written story? This temporal puzzle challenges our very notion of explanation. We typically understand things by tracing them back to their causes, but what happens when causality itself becomes circular? The photograph exists because it always existed, an explanation that explains nothing while somehow explaining everything. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of the photograph paradox is what it reveals about meaning and purpose. In a world where origins can be circular, maybe meaning doesn't require an absolute beginning. Perhaps significance can emerge from the relationships and patterns we create, even if they loop back on themselves. As we contemplate this paradox, we begin to see similar patterns everywhere. Our thoughts influence our emotions, which influence our thoughts. Our beliefs shape our experiences, which shape our beliefs. We are caught in countless feedback loops of existence, each one a miniature version of our time-traveling photographer. In the end, the photograph paradox reminds us that reality is more intricate than our linear models suggest. Sometimes understanding means embracing circular patterns rather than seeking straight lines. It invites us to question not just where things come from, but what it means for anything to truly begin. Imagine a library with an infinite number of books. Within this vast collection, there exists a special catalog that lists every book containing false information. Now ask yourself, should this catalog include itself? If it lists all books with false information and contains no errors, then it must include itself. But that would make it false, meaning it should be listed. Yet if it's listed, it becomes a true catalog of false books, meaning it shouldn't be included. This is the librarian's paradox, a puzzle that reveals the slippery nature of truth and self-reference. At first glance, this might seem like a mere logical game, but its implications reach far deeper into the nature of knowledge and certainty. Consider how we verify information in our own world. We fact-check sources, cross-reference materials, and rely on trusted authorities. But who fact-checks the fact-checkers? Who verifies the verifiers? Like our infinite library catalog, we often find ourselves in cycles of authentication that have no clear beginning or end. The paradox becomes even more fascinating when we consider its real-world applications. In the age of digital information, we face similar challenges with automated systems designed to detect misinformation. Should these systems scrutinize themselves? Can a system designed to identify false information ever be truly complete without examining its own potential for error? This leads us to a broader question about the nature of truth itself. We often think of truth as something absolute and unchanging, but the librarian's paradox suggests that our very attempts to categorize and systematize truth can create contradictions. It's like trying to catch a shadow. The very act of reaching for it changes its position. Think about how this applies to human consciousness and self-awareness. Our minds constantly catalog and categorize information about the world, including information about themselves. We form beliefs about our own beliefs, thoughts about our own thoughts. Like the paradoxical catalog, we are both the observers and the observed, creating endless loops of self-reference. The paradox also highlights the limitations of formal systems. Just as our infinite library catalog breaks down when it tries to classify itself, many logical systems encounter similar problems when they attempt to be fully self-referential. This reveals something profound about the nature of knowledge and understanding. Sometimes completeness and consistency are mutually exclusive. Preparing and narrating this theory took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the theory. Consider the implications for artificial intelligence and machine learning. As we develop systems capable of processing and categorizing vast amounts of information, we encounter the same fundamental questions raised by the librarian's paradox. Can a system fully understand its own limitations? Can it accurately catalog its own potential for error? The paradox extends into questions of authority and expertise. In any field of knowledge, experts rely on criteria to evaluate claims in their domain. But what validates these criteria? Like our catalog of false books, attempts to create absolute standards often lead to circular reasoning or infinite regress. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of the librarian's paradox is what it reveals about human understanding itself. Our minds naturally seek to organize and categorize information to create systems that can separate truth from falsehood. But the paradox suggests that this very tendency can create blind spots in our thinking. This doesn't mean we should abandon the pursuit of truth or the organization of knowledge. Rather, it invites us to approach these tasks with humility and awareness of their inherent complexities. Like a librarian in our infinite library, we must learn to navigate vast seas of information while acknowledging the fundamental limitations of our cataloging systems. The librarian's paradox reminds us that sometimes the most valuable insights come not from resolving contradictions, but from understanding why they arise. It teaches us that knowledge isn't just about accumulating information. It's about understanding the complex relationships between different pieces of information, including our own role in organizing and interpreting them. Picture yourself in a vast desert, walking toward a shimmering oasis in the distance. The closer you get, the further it seems to recede. This isn't just a mirage, it's a metaphor for what philosophers call the horizon paradox. No matter how far you travel toward the horizon, it always maintains the same distance from you. The very act of approaching it moves it away, creating an endless chase that can never be completed. This paradox extends far beyond physical horizons. Consider the pursuit of knowledge. The more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know. Each answer reveals new questions. Each discovery uncovers new mysteries. Like the horizon that perpetually retreats, complete understanding seems to remain forever just beyond our reach. The horizon paradox manifests in countless aspects of human experience. Think about technological progress. Each advancement that promises to solve our problems often creates new, unexpected challenges. We develop antibiotics only to face antibiotic-resistant bacteria. We create social media to connect people, only to discover new forms of isolation and division. The horizon of perfect solutions constantly eludes us. What makes this paradox particularly fascinating is its implications for human aspiration and achievement. Unlike simpler paradoxes that create logical contradictions, the horizon paradox speaks to something deeper about the nature of progress and pursuit. It suggests that perhaps the value lies not in reaching our destination, but in the perpetual journey toward it. Consider how this applies to personal growth and self-improvement. The moment we achieve a goal, new aspirations arise. Master one skill, and we become aware of countless others to learn. Reach one level of success, and new definitions of success emerge. The horizon of self-actualization keeps moving, always visible, but never quite attainable. This endless pursuit might seem frustrating, even futile, but there's a profound beauty in this perpetual motion. Like a mathematician approaching, but never reaching infinity, we grow through the very act of striving. The horizon's retreat isn't a cruel trick. It's the mechanism that keeps us moving forward, learning, evolving. The paradox also reveals something important about human consciousness and perception. Our awareness of the horizon, whether physical, intellectual, or spiritual, creates the very distance we seek to cross. It's our capacity to envision something beyond our current position that makes the horizon exist at all. In this way, the paradox is a product of our own consciousness, our ability to imagine and aspire. Think about how this applies to scientific understanding. Each breakthrough in physics, biology, or astronomy doesn't just answer questions. It reveals new horizons of inquiry. The universe seems to expand in complexity as fast as our ability to comprehend it. Yet this very expansion drives scientific progress, pushing us to develop new tools, theories, and ways of thinking. The horizon of paradox also offers insights into the nature of satisfaction and desire. We often believe that achieving certain goals will bring lasting fulfillment, only to find that fulfillment itself is a moving target. This isn't because our achievements aren't real or meaningful, but because our capacity for aspiration is part of what makes us human. Perhaps most profoundly, the paradox challenges our traditional notions of success and completion. In a world where horizons constantly recede, maybe success isn't about final arrival, but about maintaining graceful motion. It's about finding joy and meaning in the journey itself, knowing that the horizon will always be there, beckoning us forward. This perspective transforms the seemingly frustrating aspect of the paradox into something empowering. The ever-retreating horizon isn't a barrier to fulfillment. It's an invitation to perpetual growth. Like a dancer who finds beauty not in standing still, but in continuous movement, we can learn to appreciate the dynamic nature of our relationship with all horizons. Consider a sculptor who claims to have created the most perfectly flawed statue in existence. If the statue is perfect in its flaws, isn't that a kind of perfection? But if it's perfect, how can it be perfectly flawed? This is the perfection paradox, a riddle that challenges our understanding of ideals, imperfection, and the nature of excellence itself. At first glance, the concept of perfect imperfection might seem like mere wordplay. But as we delve deeper, we discover that this paradox touches on fundamental questions about how we define and pursue excellence in all aspects of life. What does it mean for something to be perfect? Can imperfection itself be a form of perfection? Consider how this paradox plays out in nature. We often speak of perfect symmetry as a mark of beauty, yet nature's most resilient and adaptive systems often incorporate asymmetry and irregularity. A perfectly symmetrical tree would be brittle and vulnerable to strong winds. It's precisely the imperfections, the uneven distribution of branches, the irregular growth patterns, that make it strong and adaptable. The same principle appears in human creativity and art. Musicians introduce subtle imperfections into their performances to make them feel more authentic and emotionally resonant. Photographers seek out imperfect moments that capture perfect truth. Writers deliberately break grammatical rules to achieve perfect expression. In each case, the flaw becomes the feature. The imperfection creates the perfection. This paradox extends into the realm of personal development and self-acceptance. We often strive for perfect self-improvement, yet this very striving can become a form of self-rejection. The perfectly flawed statue reminds us that perhaps true growth isn't about achieving perfection, but about perfectly embracing our imperfections. Think about relationships and love. We might seek the perfect partner, only to discover that it's our ability to perfectly accept each other's imperfections that creates the deepest bonds. The flaws and quirks become not just tolerable, but essential elements of the relationship's unique perfection. The perfection paradox also appears in scientific understanding. The more precisely we measure something, the more uncertainty we introduce into other aspects of the measurement. This is a fundamental principle of quantum mechanics. Perfect precision in one dimension creates imperfection in another. The universe itself seems to embrace this paradox at its most fundamental level. Consider how this applies to leadership and organizational development. The pursuit of perfect efficiency often leads to brittle systems that break under stress. The most resilient organizations often maintain deliberate inefficiencies, redundancies, slack resources, diversity of approaches that make them perfectly adapted to handle uncertainty and change. The paradox even extends to our understanding of knowledge and wisdom. Perfect knowledge might seem like an ideal to strive for, yet the wisest individuals often maintain a perfect awareness of their own ignorance. Socrates was considered the wisest man in Athens precisely because he perfectly understood the imperfection of his knowledge. This brings us to a deeper truth about the nature of perfection itself. Perhaps perfection isn't a fixed state to be achieved, but a dynamic balance to be maintained. Like a tightrope walker who stays upright through constant small adjustments, true perfection might lie in the perfect response to imperfection rather than the absence of flaws. The perfection paradox teaches us something profound about how we approach goals and aspirations. Instead of seeing perfection and imperfection as opposites, we might view them as complementary aspects of a deeper wholeness. The perfectly flawed statue isn't a contradiction. It's a reminder that true excellence often means transcending the very dichotomy of perfect and imperfect. Imagine a virtuoso musician who practices until every note is technically flawless, only to discover that this very perfection has stripped the music of its soul. Each note rings out with pristine clarity, yet something essential is missing. This is the virtuoso's paradox, where the relentless pursuit of technical perfection can lead to artistic emptiness. Think about what happens when you focus too intently on a familiar word. Repeat it enough times, and it begins to lose its meaning, becoming a strange collection of sounds. Similarly, the musician who obsesses over technical precision might find that the music loses its emotional resonance. The notes become isolated moments rather than parts of a flowing whole. This paradox extends far beyond music. Consider an actor who meticulously plans every gesture, every facial expression, every vocal inflection. Despite flawless execution, their performance might feel mechanical, lacking the spontaneity and authenticity that makes great acting come alive. The very effort to control every detail undermines the natural flow of emotional expression. The virtuoso's paradox reveals something profound about the nature of mastery itself. True mastery isn't just about perfect control. It's about knowing when to let go, when to allow imperfection to breathe life into performance. It's about understanding that sometimes the cracks in our control are where the light gets in. This principle manifests in countless areas of human endeavor. Think about public speaking. A perfectly memorized speech might be technically flawless, but feel lifeless compared to one delivered with natural variation and responsive engagement with the audience. The speaker who tries to control every word might end up losing their connection with the listeners. The paradox also appears in athletic performance. Athletes who focus too intensely on perfect form can become rigid and self-conscious, losing the fluid, instinctive movement that characterizes peak performance. It's often in the moments of letting go that athletes achieve their greatest feats. Consider how this applies to creativity and innovation. The artist who strives for perfect execution might produce technically impressive work that lacks emotional impact. The writer who obsesses over every word might create prose that's grammatically flawless but emotionally sterile. True creativity often requires a willingness to loosen our grip on control. This paradox teaches us something important about the relationship between discipline and freedom. The virtuoso musician must master their instrument through rigorous practice, yet ultimately needs to transcend this technical mastery to create truly moving art. The discipline creates the foundation, but the magic happens in the spaces where control relaxes into flow. Think about how this applies to personal relationships. Someone trying to be the perfect friend or partner might become so focused on doing everything right that they lose the spontaneity and authenticity that make relationships meaningful. Perfect behavior doesn't necessarily create perfect connections. The virtuoso's paradox also has implications for education and learning. Students who focus solely on perfect test scores might miss the deeper understanding that comes from engaging with material in a more open, exploratory way. The pursuit of perfect grades can sometimes interfere with perfect learning. Perhaps most profoundly, this paradox reveals something about the nature of excellence itself. True excellence isn't about achieving perfect control over every element. It's about creating the conditions where something greater than our conscious control can emerge. It's about building the technical foundation that allows us to forget technique altogether. This understanding transforms how we might approach mastery in any field. Instead of seeing practice as a path to perfect control, we might view it as a way to develop the capability to let go consciously and skillfully. The goal isn't to eliminate all uncertainty, but to become comfortable dancing with it. What if remembering something actually changes the memory itself? Every time you recall a precious moment, you're not just remembering it, you're reconstructing it, subtly altering it, creating something both old and new. This is the memory paradox, where the very act of remembering transforms what we remember, making our most cherished memories simultaneously more precious and less accurate with each recall. Think about your earliest childhood memory. As you picture it now, that scene seems vivid, real, unchangeable. But each time you've revisited this memory over the years, you've unconsciously modified it, adding details from later experiences, removing elements that don't fit your current self-narrative, shaping it into something that's neither purely fact nor pure fiction. The implications of this paradox are profound. If memories change when we recall them, what happens to our sense of personal history? We build our identities on the foundation of our memories, yet these very memories are constantly shifting, like sand dunes in a desert wind. Each remembering is also a subtle forgetting, a small transformation of what was into what we need it to be. Consider how this affects our relationships. When two people remember a shared experience differently, who's right? The memory paradox suggests that both versions might be equally valid and equally altered by the very act of remembering. Each person's memory has evolved along its own path, shaped by subsequent experiences, emotions, and the unique way their mind reconstructs the past. This paradox extends into how we understand truth itself. If our memories are constantly being rewritten, what does this mean for eyewitness testimony, personal histories, or our understanding of historical events? The past isn't simply preserved like a photograph. It's more like a painting that's continuously being retouched, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. The memory paradox also reveals something fascinating about how our brains work. Unlike a computer that stores information in fixed locations, our memories are dynamic, distributed networks of connections. Each time we access a memory, we strengthen some connections and weaken others, literally rewiring our brains in the process of remembering. Think about how this affects our emotional lives. A painful memory might become less sharp with each recall, as our minds naturally soften its edges. Or a happy memory might grow more elaborate and detailed as we embellish it with each retelling. Our memories aren't just records of the past. They're tools we use to make sense of our present and imagine our future. This has profound implications for healing and personal growth. If memories are malleable, then perhaps the way we choose to remember events is as important as what actually happened. Not in the sense of denying reality, but in understanding that our relationship with our memories is dynamic and potentially healing. Consider how this paradox influences collective memory and cultural identity. Societies, like individuals, constantly revise their understanding of the past. Historical narratives evolve not just because we discover new facts, but because the very act of remembering as a culture changes what we remember and how we remember it. The memory paradox also teaches us something important about presence and mindfulness. If our memories are constantly being reshaped by the present moment, then perhaps the most authentic way to honor our past is to be fully present now, creating memories with the awareness that they will evolve with us. This understanding can be both liberating and unsettling. It suggests that we're not bound by our memories in the way we might have thought, but it also challenges our notion of having a fixed, unchangeable past. Every memory is a collaboration between our past and present selves, a bridge between what was and what is. Have you ever noticed that the more you try to be unique, the more you end up conforming to some other pattern of uniqueness? This is the identity paradox, where the deliberate pursuit of individuality often leads to its own form of conformity. Think of someone who strives to be different by adopting an alternative lifestyle, only to find themselves following the unwritten rules of alternative culture. The paradox deepens when we consider how identity forms in the first place. We develop our sense of self through interaction with others, through language and concepts we inherit from our culture. Even our most personal thoughts are shaped by words and ideas that came from somewhere else. How then can we claim true individuality when the very tools we use to express it are collectively created? Consider fashion rebels who reject mainstream styles. In doing so, they often unknowingly create new uniform codes, new standards of what it means to be different. The punk movement, for instance, began as a rejection of conventional fashion, but eventually developed its own rigid aesthetic rules. The more people tried to express their uniqueness through punk style, the more they ended up looking alike. This pattern appears everywhere we look. Artists seeking to break free from tradition often end up creating new traditions. Philosophers attempting to think outside the box find themselves in another, perhaps larger box. Even those who proudly claim to think for themselves might be following a script of independent thinking written by others. The identity paradox reveals something profound about human nature. We are social creatures who crave both belonging and distinctiveness. We want to be unique, but we also want our uniqueness to be recognized and validated. by others. This creates a constant tension between individuality and community, between standing out and fitting in. Think about social media, where millions of people simultaneously try to express their unique personalities through standardized formats and filters. Each person strives to show their individual perspective, yet the overall effect is often a kind of curated uniformity. The more we try to distinguish ourselves, the more we might end up following familiar patterns of self-presentation. This paradox extends into how we think about authenticity. Often, the more consciously we try to be ourselves, the more artificial we feel. True authenticity seems to emerge not from deliberately trying to be different, but from forgetting to try at all. It's like trying to fall asleep. The harder you try, the more it eludes you. Consider how this plays out in professional life. Companies claim to value thinking outside the box, but this very phrase has become a box of its own. Innovation becomes standardized, creativity becomes formulaic, and the pursuit of uniqueness leads to a new kind of conformity. The identity paradox also reveals something important about influence and originality. Every attempt to be original builds on what came before. Even rejection of influence is a form of influence. The truly unique voice often emerges not from trying to avoid all influences, but from synthesizing them in personal ways. Perhaps most profoundly, this paradox challenges our very conception of individuality. What if true uniqueness isn't about being entirely different from everyone else, but about embracing the particular way we combine common human experiences and traits? Maybe authenticity comes not from rejecting all external influences, but from consciously choosing which influences to embrace. This understanding transforms how we might approach personal development. Instead of striving to be completely unique, we might focus on being genuinely ourselves, even if that means sharing characteristics with others. After all, the fact that others share our traits doesn't make those traits any less truly ours. Picture a desert island where a group of people have agreed to create a perfectly just society. They gather to write their constitution, but encounter a strange problem. To create fair rules, they need to consider everyone's perspective equally. Yet some voices are naturally louder, some minds naturally quicker to articulate their thoughts. In trying to achieve perfect fairness, they find themselves caught in what philosophers call the justice paradox. This paradox emerges from a simple but profound question. How can we create truly fair rules when the very process of creating them is influenced by existing inequalities? Even with the best intentions, those who are more articulate, more confident, or more persuasive naturally shape the discussion more than others. The very attempt to establish justice seems to perpetuate certain forms of inequality. Consider how this plays out in real-world attempts at fairness. A company wants to create an unbiased hiring process, so they implement standardized tests. But these tests inevitably favor those who are good at taking tests, or those who had better educational opportunities. The attempt to remove one form of bias creates another. The more rigorously they try to standardize the process, the more they might inadvertently advantage certain groups over others. The justice paradox extends beyond formal systems into everyday life. Think about parents trying to treat their children equally. They might give each child exactly the same amount of attention, the same privileges, the same responsibilities. Yet each child is unique, with different needs, capabilities, and challenges. perfect equality of treatment might actually result in unfairness, while true fairness might require unequal treatment. This paradox reveals something profound about the nature of justice itself. Perhaps perfect fairness isn't about treating everyone exactly the same, but about recognizing and accommodating differences. Yet this raises another question. Who decides which differences matter? How do we determine which inequalities are just and which are unjust? Consider how this applies to education. A truly fair educational system might need to treat students differently based on their individual needs and circumstances. But the moment we start making these distinctions, we risk creating new forms of unfairness. The very tools we use to address inequality can become sources of inequality themselves. The justice paradox also appears in attempts to correct historical injustices. How do we fairly compensate for past unfairness without creating new unfairness? Programs designed to level the playing field often face criticism from both those who think they go too far and those who think they don't go far enough. The pursuit of perfect justice seems to generate new controversies even as it resolves old ones. Think about how this paradox manifests in international relations. Countries gather to create fair rules for global trade or climate action. But some nations are more powerful, have more resources, or face different challenges. How can we create truly fair global agreements when the very process of negotiation reflects existing power imbalances? Perhaps most profoundly, the justice paradox challenges our understanding of what justice means. Is it about equality of opportunity or equality of outcome? Is it about treating everyone the same or giving everyone what they need? These questions have no easy answers, yet how we answer them shapes every attempt to create a fairer world. The paradox also reveals something important about human nature. We seem to have an innate sense of fairness, yet we often disagree about what fairness means in practice. Our very attempt to define and implement justice reveals the complexity of human society and the challenges of balancing competing needs and perspectives. Consider a wise teacher who tells her students, "Question everything I tell you." If the students truly follow this advice, shouldn't they also question this instruction itself? But if they question it, and consequently decide not to question everything, aren't they actually following it? This is the teacher's paradox, a puzzle that reveals the complex nature of authority, wisdom, and the transmission of knowledge. At its heart, this paradox explores the tension between guidance and independence, between accepting wisdom and developing our own understanding. The teacher who encourages students to question everything, including their own authority, creates a fascinating loop of logic that challenges our basic assumptions about learning and teaching. Think about how this plays out in real education. A good teacher wants students to think critically, to question assumptions, to develop independent thought. Yet the very process of teaching requires some degree of authority, some acceptance of guidance. The student who questions absolutely everything might never learn anything, while the student who questions nothing might learn only superficially. The paradox deepens when we consider how knowledge itself is transmitted. Traditional wisdom often includes warnings about the limitations of traditional wisdom. Ancient philosophers taught their students to be skeptical of teachings, including, presumably, this very teaching about skepticism. The message becomes tangled in its own delivery. Consider how this applies to parenting. A parent might want to teach their child to be independent, to think for themselves. But the very act of teaching independence is a form of guidance that the child must, to some degree, accept. The parent who says, "Don't just do what I tell you," is still, in a way, telling the child what to do. The teacher's paradox also appears in leadership. A great leader might encourage their team to challenge authority and think independently. But what happens when team members challenge this very principle? Should they be encouraged in their rejection of the encouragement to challenge? The logic twists back on itself like a Mobius strip. This paradox reveals something profound about the nature of learning and growth. Perhaps true education isn't about either complete acceptance or complete questioning, but about developing the wisdom to know when to do each. It's about learning to navigate the space between trust and skepticism, between receiving wisdom and developing our own. Think about how this applies to personal development. Many spiritual and philosophical traditions encourage followers to find their own path, to question everything, and discover truth for themselves. Yet these very traditions are often passed down through teachers, texts, and established practices. The seeker must somehow use the master's teachings to transcend the need for the master's teachings. The teacher's paradox also highlights the role of contradiction in learning. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come not from clear, consistent instructions, but from wrestling with apparent contradictions. The student who grapples with the paradox of questioning everything might develop a deeper understanding than one who simply accepts or rejects teachings without reflection. Consider how this paradox appears in scientific inquiry. Science progresses through questioning and skepticism, yet it also builds on accepted knowledge and established methods. The scientist must simultaneously respect the foundations of their field while remaining willing to challenge any aspect of it. They must learn the rules well enough to know when and how to break them. Imagine a society where everyone has access to a device that can predict their future with perfect accuracy. At first, this seems like a dream come true, the end of uncertainty, the ability to make perfect decisions. But then, something strange happens. Knowing their future causes people to try to change it, which in turn changes what the device predicts. This is the oracle's paradox, where perfect prediction becomes impossible precisely because it's possible. Consider what happens when someone receives a prediction they don't like. They naturally try to avoid that future, but their very attempt to avoid it becomes part of the new prediction. The device updates its forecast, which prompts new attempts at avoidance, creating an endless loop of prediction and response. The more accurate the prediction, the more it influences behavior, and the more it needs to change. This paradox reveals something profound about the nature of knowledge and free will. If we could know our future with certainty, would that knowledge itself change what's possible? A person told they'll fail an exam might study harder, thus invalidating the prediction. Someone predicted to find love might become complacent, thereby preventing the very meeting that was foreseen. The implications extend far beyond individual choices. Think about economic forecasts. When they predict a recession, people often change their behavior in ways that either hasten or prevent the predicted downturn. The very accuracy of the prediction makes it self-defeating or self-fulfilling. Markets respond to predictions about markets, creating feedback loops that challenge the very possibility of accurate forecasting. Consider how this plays out in weather prediction. As our forecasting becomes more accurate, people adjust their plans accordingly. A prediction of rain causes people to cancel outdoor events, which might change the very patterns of human activity that influence local weather conditions. The more precise our predictions become, the more they influence the systems they're trying to predict. The oracle's paradox also appears in social movements and cultural change. When experts predict certain social trends, people react to these predictions in ways that accelerate or resist the predicted changes. A forecast about the death of a tradition might inspire efforts to preserve it, while a prediction of a new trend might cause people to embrace it early, changing the timeline of its adoption. This paradox reveals something important about the relationship between knowledge and action. Perfect prediction assumes a universe where knowing doesn't influence doing, where observation doesn't affect outcome. But in reality, especially in human systems, knowledge changes behavior, and behavior changes what can be known. Think about how this affects personal growth and development. If someone could see their future self with perfect clarity, would that vision become impossible to achieve precisely because they saw it? The person who sees themselves becoming humble might develop pride in their predicted humility. The one who sees themselves achieving greatness might become complacent. The oracle's paradox also challenges our understanding of fate and destiny. In a world where perfect prediction is possible, is anything truly predetermined? Or does the very existence of prediction create a new kind of freedom? The freedom to respond to and potentially alter what's foreseen. Perhaps destiny itself becomes a moving target, constantly reshaped by our awareness of it. What if the key to inner peace is accepting that you'll never find inner peace? This is the serenity paradox, where the very pursuit of tranquility creates the anxiety and restlessness that prevent us from achieving it. Like trying to force yourself to fall asleep, the harder you try to find peace, the more it eludes you. Consider the person who dedicates themselves to achieving perfect mental calm. They read self-help books, practice meditation, follow every technique for stress reduction. Yet, with each new method, they become increasingly frustrated by their lack of progress. Their determination to find peace becomes a source of tension, creating the very disturbance they're trying to eliminate. This paradox appears in countless forms of self-improvement. The more intensely we focus on becoming happy, the more we notice our unhappiness. The more desperately we try to relax, the more tense we become. It's as if the very act of pursuing these states creates resistance to achieving them. Think about someone trying to practice mindfulness. They sit down to meditate, determined to clear their mind of thoughts. But this very determination becomes a thought to clear away. The more they try to empty their mind, the more it fills with thoughts about emptying their mind. The goal itself becomes an obstacle to reaching it. The serenity paradox reveals something profound about the nature of consciousness and self-awareness. Our minds seem designed to solve problems, to work toward goals, but some states of being, peace, happiness, relaxation, resist this problem-solving approach. They can't be achieved through direct effort because the effort itself creates tension. Consider how this plays out in relationships. Someone might try so hard to be authentic that they become self-conscious and artificial. Or they might work so intensely at being spontaneous that they lose all natural flow. The very attempt to manufacture these qualities prevents them from emerging naturally. This paradox extends into broader questions about personal development. Many people set goals for self-improvement, become more confident, more compassionate, more centered. But the more they focus on these goals, the more they reinforce their current sense of inadequacy. The pursuit of self-improvement can become a form of self-rejection. The serenity paradox also appears in spiritual and philosophical traditions. Many teach that enlightenment comes from letting go of the desire for enlightenment. The person who strives too hard for spiritual advancement may be furthest from their goal, while one who abandons the pursuit might unexpectedly find what they were seeking. Think about how this affects our approach to life's challenges. Often, the more desperately we try to solve a problem, the more we become entangled in it. Sometimes solutions emerge not from intense effort, but from letting go, from allowing space for natural resolution. The paradox suggests that certain kinds of progress come not from trying harder, but from trying differently, or perhaps from not trying at all. The paradox also reveals something important about the nature of acceptance. True acceptance isn't something we can force or achieve through effort. It emerges naturally when we stop trying to make things different from what they are. Yet this very insight creates a new challenge. How do we accept our non-acceptance? How do we find peace with our lack of peace? Have you ever noticed that the more connected we become through technology, the more disconnected we often feel? This is a connection paradox, where tools designed to bring us closer together sometimes drive us further apart. In a world where we can instantly communicate with anyone, anywhere, many people report feeling more isolated than ever before. Consider someone with thousands of social media friends who still feels profoundly lonely. They scroll through endless updates about others' lives, like posts, share comments, yet something essential seems missing. The more they engage with these digital connections, the more they might feel the absence of deeper, more meaningful relationships. This paradox extends beyond social media. Think about families sitting together at dinner, each absorbed in their own device. They're technically more connected than ever to the world at large, but perhaps less connected to those physically present. The very tools that promise to enhance our relationships might be transforming them in ways we never intended. The connection paradox reveals something profound about human nature. We seem to crave both connection and authenticity, yet the easier connection becomes, the more we might question its authenticity. A heartfelt conversation might feel more meaningful than 100 likes or shares, even though it reaches fewer people. Consider how this plays out in professional relationships. Remote work tools allow us to collaborate with colleagues worldwide, yet many people report missing the spontaneous interactions of office life. The very efficiency that makes digital communication attractive might eliminate the small, seemingly inefficient moments where real bonds are formed. This paradox also appears in how we experience events. People at concerts or performances often watch through their phones, trying to capture and share the moment. But in doing so, they might miss the direct, unmediated experience. The desire to connect with absent others can disconnect us from the present moment. The implications go deeper when we consider how this affects human development. Children growing up in a hyper-connected world might have hundreds of online friends, but struggle with face-to-face interaction. They might be expert at digital communication, but find themselves anxious about real-world social situations. Think about how this paradox influences our attention and presence. The ability to connect with anyone at any time means we're rarely fully present with anyone at any time. Our attention is constantly divided, split between the physical and digital worlds, between present company and potential connections. The connection paradox also reveals something important about the nature of human relationships. Perhaps meaningful connection requires not just communication, but vulnerability, not just presence, but attention, not just contact, but engagement. The easier it becomes to connect superficially, the harder we might need to work to connect deeply. Consider how this affects our sense of community. We can now join online groups based on any shared interest, finding like-minded people across the globe. Yet local communities might suffer as people invest more energy in digital connections than in their physical neighborhoods. The ability to connect with anyone anywhere might make it harder to connect with someone right here. Imagine a person who spends their entire life documenting every moment, determined to preserve each experience perfectly. They photograph every meal, record every conversation, journal every thought. Yet the more thoroughly they document their life, the less they seem to actually live it. This is the preservation paradox, where the attempt to capture life perfectly can prevent us from fully experiencing it. Think about tourists at a beautiful landmark, so busy taking photos that they barely look at the actual site before them. Their desire to preserve the moment for later viewing prevents them from being present in the moment itself. The more completely they try to capture the experience, the less of the experience they actually have to capture. It's as if the very act of preservation somehow diminishes what's being preserved. The implications of this paradox extend far beyond tourism. Consider someone who's so focused on recording their child's first steps that they watch it through their phone screen rather than with their own eyes. The video might be perfect, but something of the direct, unmediated experience is lost. The parent gains a permanent record but loses the immediacy of the moment, the full emotional impact of witnessing their child's milestone firsthand. This paradox reveals something profound about human experience and memory. Our brains don't work like cameras or recording devices. The most meaningful memories aren't usually the most perfectly preserved ones, but rather those where we were most fully present and engaged. A blurry photo of a moment deeply lived might hold more real meaning than a perfect recording of a moment half experienced. Consider how this plays out in relationships. People who constantly document their romantic relationships for social media might find themselves performing their love rather than simply living it. The drive to capture perfect moments can make those moments feel staged, inauthentic. The relationship becomes something to be showcased rather than simply experienced, and something essential is lost in the translation. The preservation paradox also appears in our approach to history and culture. In our eagerness to preserve traditional practices, we sometimes freeze them in time, removing the very adaptability that kept them relevant and alive. A cultural tradition that's preserved too perfectly might become more like a museum piece than a living, evolving practice. The very act of preservation can kill what we're trying to keep alive. Think about how this affects our relationship with time. The more we try to hold on to moments to prevent them from slipping away, the more aware we become of their impermanence. Our attempt to freeze time makes us more conscious of its passage. The harder we try to preserve the present, the more it seems to elude us. This paradox has particular relevance in our digital age. We now have the ability to record and store vast amounts of information about our lives. Every email, text message, and social media post becomes part of our personal archive. But does having access to all these perfect records actually enrich our experience of life? Or does it sometimes become a burden, a distraction from the present moment? Consider how this affects creativity and artistic expression. An artist so concerned with preserving their process might lose the spontaneity that makes their work vibrant. A musician too focused on recording every practice session might miss the joy of simply playing for pleasure. The drive to document can interfere with the very creativity we're trying to capture. The preservation paradox also reveals something important about learning and growth. Sometimes our attempt to preserve knowledge in perfect form can make it more difficult to truly understand. A student who records every word of a lecture might miss the deeper connections that come from active engagement with the material. The perfect notes become a substitute for real understanding. What happens when a society becomes so tolerant that it must decide whether to tolerate intolerance? This is the democracy paradox, where the very principles that make a free society possible can also become its greatest vulnerability. Imagine a system so committed to freedom that it must question whether to allow forces that might destroy that freedom. This paradox plays out in countless ways across modern democracies. Consider a university dedicated to free speech and open debate. When confronted with speakers who advocate against these very principles, what should they do? If they allow these voices, they risk undermining the values they stand for. If they restrict them, they violate their own principles of openness. The contradiction cuts to the heart of democratic ideals. The implications stretch far beyond academic settings. Think about a society that values religious freedom. What happens when one religious group's practices infringe on another's rights? The same freedom that allows all beliefs to flourish might also protect beliefs that seek to limit others' freedoms. The system's strength, its openness to all viewpoints, becomes a potential weakness. This paradox reveals something profound about the nature of freedom itself. True freedom can't be unlimited. It requires boundaries to survive. But who sets these boundaries? How do we decide which limitations on freedom are necessary to preserve freedom itself? These questions have no easy answers, yet they're crucial to maintaining democratic societies. Consider how this plays out in the realm of tolerance. A truly tolerant society might pride itself on accepting all viewpoints and ways of life. But what happens when some of these viewpoints actively promote intolerance? The paradox forces us to confront the limits of tolerance, to recognize that unlimited tolerance might lead to the destruction of tolerance itself. The democracy paradox also appears in how societies handle extremism. Democratic systems provide mechanisms for peaceful change and protest, but these same mechanisms can be used by those who wish to end democratic practices. the freedom to organize, to speak, to influence others, essential features of democracy, can become tools for anti-democratic forces. Think about how this affects political discourse. In a healthy democracy, all voices should be heard, all perspectives considered. But what about voices that call for the silencing of others? What about perspectives that deny the basic humanity of certain groups? The system's commitment to openness creates vulnerabilities that its opponents can exploit. This paradox has particular relevance in the digital age. Social media platforms face similar dilemmas. Should they allow all speech in the name of freedom, even speech that might incite violence or spread harmful misinformation? The very openness that makes these platforms valuable for democratic discourse also makes them potential vehicles for democracy's undoing. The democracy paradox also reveals something important about human nature and society. We seem to need both freedom and structure, both openness and limits. A society without any restrictions on freedom might quickly lose the stability needed for freedom to flourish. Yet too many restrictions can stifle the very liberty they're meant to protect. Consider how this plays out in education. Schools aim to teach critical thinking and independent judgment, yet they must also transmit certain basic values and principles. How do we teach students to question everything, while also ensuring they develop the fundamental beliefs necessary for a democratic citizenship? The balance is delicate and ever-shifting. Picture a wise person who spends years mastering a skill, only to realize that true mastery means forgetting everything they've learned. This is the mastery paradox, where the highest form of knowledge often requires transcending knowledge itself. Like a musician who must learn all the rules of music theory only to break them instinctively, or a martial artist who studies precise forms only to eventually move beyond them. The implications of this paradox reach deep into the nature of expertise and understanding. Consider a chef who spends decades perfecting classical techniques, measuring ingredients precisely, following traditional recipes exactly. Yet at the peak of their mastery, they might cook entirely by instinct, without measurements or recipes, having internalized the principles so deeply that conscious thought becomes unnecessary, even counterproductive. This paradox reveals something profound about how humans learn and grow. The path to mastery often follows a circular route, from natural ignorance through studied complexity and back to a new kind of simplicity. A child draws freely without worry, then learns formal artistic techniques, only to eventually rediscover a kind of freedom, but now informed by deep understanding. Think about how this plays out in meditation and mindfulness practices. Beginners often start with simple breathing exercises, then learn complex techniques and philosophical concepts, only to eventually return to simple breathing, but with a fundamentally different quality of attention. The simplicity at the end of the journey is qualitatively different from the simplicity at the beginning. The mastery paradox also appears in professional development. An executive might study countless leadership theories and management techniques, only to discover that the most effective leadership often comes from authentic presence rather than applied theory. Yet this authenticity is somehow different from naive spontaneity. It's informed by deep understanding while transcending conscious application. The paradox reveals something important about the relationship between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge might be about accumulating information, but wisdom often involves knowing when to let that information go. It's like climbing a ladder, only to realize you need to leave it behind to reach the final height. Think about how this manifests in sports and physical activities. An athlete might spend years perfecting their technique through careful, conscious practice. But in the moment of peak performance, conscious thought often becomes an obstacle. The body seems to know what to do without the mind's interference. Yet this automatic performance is only possible because of all the previous conscious learning. The mastery paradox also has implications for how we think about education and training. Traditional education often focuses on accumulating knowledge, but perhaps true mastery requires learning how to transcend that knowledge at the right moment. It's not about forgetting what we've learned, but about transforming it from conscious thought into intuitive understanding. Consider how this plays out in personal development and self-improvement. Many people study psychological techniques, therapeutic approaches, and self-help methods, only to find that real transformation often comes when they stop trying to apply these methods consciously. Yet this letting go is somehow different from never having learned the methods at all. Have you ever noticed that the more options we have, the harder it becomes to be content with any choice? This is the abundance paradox, where having more possibilities can actually make us less satisfied and more anxious about our decisions. In a world of endless choices, the pursuit of the perfect option often leads to paralysis and regret. Consider walking into a modern supermarket with 50 different types of breakfast cereal. Logic suggests that more options should make us happier. Surely among all these choices, we can find exactly what we want. Yet research shows that people often feel more satisfied when choosing from a smaller selection. Each additional option increases the cognitive burden of deciding and the possibility that we might make the wrong choice. This paradox extends far beyond consumer choices. Think about streaming services with thousands of movies and TV shows. Rather than enjoying this wealth of entertainment, many people spend more time scrolling through options than actually watching anything. The fear of missing out on something better prevents them from fully engaging with any single choice. The abundance of options becomes a source of anxiety rather than enjoyment. The implications become even more profound when we consider life's major decisions. With increased global mobility and career flexibility, people have more choices than ever about where to live, what to do for work, and how to structure their lives. Yet this freedom often leads to chronic indecision and self-doubt. Each choice represents countless paths not taken, creating a burden of potential regret. Consider how this affects romantic relationships in the age of dating apps. With seemingly endless possibilities just a swipe away, people might find it harder to commit to any single relationship. The constant awareness of other options can undermine satisfaction with our current choice, even when that choice is objectively good. The abundance of possibilities makes it harder to appreciate what we have. The abundance paradox also reveals something important about human psychology. We seem to have a finite capacity for handling choices. Beyond a certain point, additional options don't enhance our freedom. They overwhelm our ability to choose wisely. Our brains, evolved for simpler times, struggle to cope with the complexity of modern choice. Think about how this manifests in professional life. Companies often pride themselves on offering employees numerous benefits and options for customizing their work experience. Yet, too much flexibility can become overwhelming. When everything is negotiable and customizable, people might spend more energy managing choices than actually working productively. The paradox extends to personal development and learning. With unlimited online courses, books, and resources, we might think it's easier than ever to learn and grow. But the sheer volume of options can make it harder to commit to any single path of development. We might bounce between different approaches without giving any of them enough time to yield results. Consider how this affects creativity and artistic expression. With digital tools offering endless possibilities for creation, artists might find themselves paralyzed by the abundance of options. A musician with thousands of virtual instruments might spend more time browsing sounds than actually composing. The potential for perfection becomes an obstacle to completion. The abundance paradox also influences how we spend our leisure time. Free time should feel more valuable when we have many options for using it. Yet people often report feeling less satisfied with their leisure when faced with too many choices. The pressure to make the most of our time can prevent us from fully enjoying any single activity. What happens when our desire for absolute safety makes us more vulnerable? This is the security paradox, where attempts to eliminate all risk can create new, often more serious dangers. Like a person who avoids all physical activity for fear of injury, only to become weaker and more susceptible to harm through inactivity. Consider how this plays out in childhood development. Parents, wanting to protect their children from every possible danger, might prevent them from engaging in risky play. Yet research shows that children who never learn to navigate reasonable risks often develop anxiety and poor risk assessment skills later in life. The very protection intended to keep them safe leaves them ill-equipped to handle real-world challenges. This paradox extends into public health and medicine. A society that overuses antibiotics to fight every minor infection might breed resistant superbugs that pose far greater threats. The immune system, like any complex system, needs some exposure to challenges to develop properly. Perfect protection can lead to increased vulnerability. The implications become even more significant in social and political contexts. Communities that implement extreme security measures might find that these very measures erode the trust and social connections that actually keep people safe. Surveillance cameras on every corner might reduce some types of crime while creating a climate of suspicion that damages community resilience. Think about financial security. Someone so afraid of losing money that they keep all their savings in cash might actually lose more to inflation than they would have risked in moderate investments. The attempt to eliminate all financial risk can lead to guaranteed loss of value over time. Perfect safety becomes a form of danger. The security paradox also appears in technological systems. Companies so focused on preventing any security breach that they make their systems incredibly complex might actually increase vulnerability through that complexity. Each additional security measure creates new potential points of failure and opportunities for human error. Consider how this affects emotional relationships. People who try to protect themselves from any possibility of emotional hurt often end up creating the very loneliness they fear. Building impenetrable walls against pain also blocks out love and connection. The pursuit of perfect emotional safety can lead to profound emotional isolation. This paradox reveals something important about the nature of security itself. Perhaps true security isn't about eliminating all risk, but about developing resilience, the ability to handle and recover from challenges. Like a tree that grows stronger through exposure to wind, systems and individuals might need some stress to develop robust security. Think about how this applies to organizational management. Companies that try to eliminate all possibility of failure through rigid controls and procedures might become so inflexible that they can't adapt to changing circumstances. Their very attempts to ensure survival make them more likely to fail when faced with unexpected challenges. The security paradox also influences how we approach personal growth. Those who never venture outside their comfort zone, seeking perfect safety from failure or embarrassment, often find themselves trapped in a shrinking world of possibilities. The quest for absolute security becomes a prison that prevents growth and fulfillment. Consider the implications for innovation and progress. A society so focused on preventing any possible negative outcome might stifle the very innovations that could make life safer and better. The fear of any risk can prevent the reasonable risks necessary for advancement. Imagine a person who becomes so focused on improving themselves that they lose sight of who they are. This is the self-improvement paradox, where the relentless pursuit of becoming better can actually prevent authentic growth and lead us further from our true selves. Like a garden that's so aggressively pruned and shaped that it loses its natural beauty, our efforts to perfect ourselves can sometimes strip away the very qualities that make us unique. Consider someone who reads every self-help book, attends every workshop, follows every productivity system, and tracks every aspect of their life. They're constantly optimizing, tweaking, and refining their habits and behaviors. Yet despite all this effort, or perhaps because of it, they feel increasingly disconnected from their authentic self. The more they try to improve, the more artificial and constructed their life becomes. This paradox manifests in countless ways across different aspects of personal development. Think about someone trying to become more charismatic. They might study body language, practice conversation techniques, and memorize social scripts. But this very focus on technique can make their interactions feel calculated and inauthentic. The pursuit of perfect social skills actually impedes genuine connection. The implications extend deep into our psychological well-being. The constant drive for self-improvement can create a perpetual state of self-judgment, where we're never quite good enough. Today's achievement becomes tomorrow's baseline, creating an endless treadmill of striving. We become like Sisyphus, eternally pushing the boulder of self-improvement up the mountain, never reaching a point of acceptance or satisfaction. Consider how this plays out in professional development. Someone might become so focused on acquiring new skills and qualifications that they lose touch with their original passion for their work. They climb the career ladder efficiently, but find themselves in a role that, while impressive on paper, feels empty of personal meaning. The drive to become better overshadows the question of better at what and for whom. The self-improvement paradox also reveals something profound about the nature of personal growth. Perhaps real development isn't always about adding new skills or habits, but sometimes about removing obstacles to our natural expression. like a sculptor who reveals the statue within the marble by removing excess stone. Genuine growth might require letting go rather than constant acquisition. Think about how this affects our relationship with time. The self-improvement mindset often treats the present moment as merely a stepping stone to a better future. But when every moment is seen as preparation for something else, when do we actually live? The constant focus on becoming better can prevent us from being present and appreciating who we already are. This paradox particularly impacts our emotional lives. In trying to optimize our emotional responses to always be positive and productive, we might deny or suppress natural feelings that are essential to being human. The pursuit of emotional perfection can lead to a kind of emotional numbness, where we're so focused on feeling the right things that we lose touch with our genuine emotional experience. Consider the impact on creativity and artistic expression. An artist so focused on improving their technique might lose the spontaneity and raw emotion that made their early work compelling. The drive for technical perfection can overshadow the authentic voice that gives art its power. Sometimes our flaws are actually essential elements of our unique creative expression. The paradox extends to our physical well-being too. Someone might become so obsessed with perfect health that they develop orthorexia, where the pursuit of healthy eating becomes unhealthy. Or they might follow such a rigid exercise routine that they lose the simple joy of movement. The quest for perfect health becomes its own form of illness. The self-improvement paradox also influences how we approach learning and education. The pressure to constantly upgrade our knowledge and skills can lead to shallow, checkbox-style learning rather than deep understanding. We might accumulate certifications and qualifications without developing genuine wisdom or practical competence. The focus on measurable improvement can actually impede meaningful learning. Think about how this affects our relationships. The drive to become a better partner, parent, or friend can make us so self-conscious about our interactions that we lose the ability to be spontaneous and genuine. Our relationships become projects to optimize rather than connections to nurture naturally. The very effort to improve our relationships can make them feel mechanical and contrived. What if the search for meaning itself prevents us from finding it? This is the meaning paradox, where our desperate quest to understand life's purpose might actually blind us to the meaning that naturally emerges when we stop searching so intensely. Like trying to see a faint star by looking directly at it. Sometimes meaning becomes visible only when we shift our gaze slightly away from it. Consider someone who constantly questions the purpose of everything they do. They analyze each action, each relationship, each career choice through the lens of its cosmic significance. Yet in this relentless examination, they might miss the simple, profound meanings that arise naturally from engaged living. Their search for capital M meaning prevents them from experiencing the small, vital meanings that make life rich. This paradox manifests particularly strongly in moments of transition or crisis. Someone facing a major life change might become so focused on finding the deeper meaning of their situation that they become paralyzed, unable to take practical action. The quest for perfect understanding becomes an obstacle to the very experiences that might generate genuine meaning. The implications extend deep into our spiritual and philosophical lives. Religious seekers might become so obsessed with finding ultimate truth that they miss the profound meanings present in ordinary moments. Their spiritual quest becomes a form of escape from the very reality where genuine spirituality might naturally emerge. The more desperately they search for enlightenment, the more it eludes them. Consider how this plays out in artistic creation. An artist so concerned with making meaningful work might find themselves unable to create anything at all. The pressure to produce something profound can block the natural flow of creativity that often leads to truly meaningful expression. Great art often emerges not from a conscious attempt to be meaningful, but from sincere engagement with the creative process itself. The meaning paradox also reveals something important about human consciousness. Our minds seem designed to seek patterns and significance, yet this very tendency can prevent us from experiencing life directly. Like a camera that's constantly adjusting its focus, we might miss the image while trying to perfect its clarity. Sometimes, meaning emerges most strongly when we stop trying to force it into focus. Think about how this affects our relationships. People so focused on having meaningful connections might struggle to form genuine bonds. They analyze every interaction, trying to extract its deeper significance, rather than simply being present with another person. The search for meaningful relationships becomes an obstacle to actual connection. This paradox particularly impacts how we approach work and career. Someone might become so fixated on finding their true calling or life's purpose that they remain stuck in analysis paralysis, unable to commit to any path. Yet meaning often emerges through committed action and engagement, not from perfect preliminary understanding. The most meaningful careers often develop through doing, rather than through endless contemplation. Consider the impact on personal development and growth. The pressure to live a meaningful life can become so overwhelming that it prevents us from fully engaging with our actual life. We might reject potentially valuable experiences because they don't seem meaningful enough in advance, not realizing that meaning often reveals itself only through lived experience. The paradox extends to how we handle grief and difficulty. Someone experiencing loss might become so focused on finding meaning in their suffering that they resist simply feeling and processing their emotions. The quest to make sense of pain can become a form of avoidance, preventing the natural healing that might ultimately reveal deeper meaning. Think about how this affects our approach to education and learning. Students, so concerned with the future significance of their studies, might miss the inherent value of learning itself. They focus on how knowledge will be useful later, rather than engaging with it deeply in the present. Yet true understanding and its meaningful application often comes from immersion in the subject for its own sake. The meaning paradox also influences how we think about happiness and fulfillment. The more directly we pursue these states, trying to make every moment meaningful and significant, the more they tend to elude us. Perhaps meaning, like happiness, is more often a byproduct of engaged living rather than something we can pursue directly. Have you ever noticed that the more we try to control something, the more it seems to slip through our fingers? This is the control paradox, where our attempts to maintain absolute control often lead to less actual influence over outcomes. Like trying to hold water too tightly in your hands, the harder you squeeze, the more it escapes. Consider a manager who micromanages their team checking every detail and controlling every decision. Their intent is to ensure perfect execution, but instead, they create a dependent, demotivated team unable to think independently. The very actions meant to guarantee success actually increase the likelihood of failure. Team members become hesitant to take initiative, creativity diminishes, and the organization becomes brittle rather than resilient. This paradox manifests powerfully in parenting. Parents who try to control every aspect of their children's lives, protecting them from all possible mistakes, often end up with children who struggle to develop independence and good judgment. The more tightly they try to control their children's paths, the less equipped these children become to navigate life's challenges. Protection becomes a form of hindrance. The implications extend deep into our personal lives. Think about someone trying to control their emotions perfectly. They might develop elaborate systems to manage their feelings, attempting to eliminate all negative emotions and maintain constant positivity. Yet this very effort often leads to emotional rigidity and suppression, creating deeper psychological issues. True emotional health often comes from accepting and working with our feelings rather than trying to control them completely. Consider how this plays out in relationships. Partners who try to control every aspect of their relationship, planning every moment, managing every interaction, preventing all possible conflicts, often find that spontaneity and genuine intimacy suffer. The relationship becomes a carefully managed project rather than a living, breathing connection between two people. The very effort to ensure perfect harmony can create distance and resentment. The control paradox also reveals something profound about complex systems. Whether in nature, society, or personal life, complex systems often require a degree of flexibility and autonomy to function well. Attempting to control them too rigidly can destroy the very properties that make them effective. Like an ecosystem that becomes vulnerable when overmanaged, human systems need some space for natural adaptation and self-regulation. Think about how this affects creativity and innovation. Organizations that try to control the creative process too tightly, with rigid procedures and excessive oversight, often find that true innovation becomes impossible. Creative breakthroughs typically require some tolerance for uncertainty, experimentation, and even failure, precisely the elements that strict control tries to eliminate. This paradox particularly impacts our relationship with uncertainty. The more desperately we try to eliminate all uncertainty from our lives, the more anxious we become about potential unknowns. People who can't tolerate any ambiguity often find themselves paralyzed by the very possibility of unpredictable outcomes. Their need for control actually increases their experience of anxiety and stress. Consider the implications for personal growth and development. Those who try to control their growth process too rigidly, following strict plans and programs, might miss the organic opportunities for learning and development that arise naturally. Real growth often occurs through unexpected challenges and unplanned experiences. Exactly the elements that excessive control tries to eliminate. The paradox extends to how we handle change and transition. The more we try to control every aspect of a major life change, the more likely we are to miss opportunities and possibilities that couldn't have been planned for. Sometimes our tight grip on how things should go prevents us from adapting to how things actually are, making transitions more difficult rather than easier. Think about how this affects goal achievement. People who try to control every step of their journey toward a goal might become so rigid in their approach that they miss better pathways that emerge along the way. The most successful individuals often combine clear intentions with flexibility about the exact route to their destination. What if the very act of seeking success becomes the greatest obstacle to achieving it? This is the success paradox, where our intense focus on achieving specific outcomes can create psychological and practical barriers that make those outcomes less likely. Like a person so fixated on winning that they become too tense to perform well, our very desire for success can sabotage our efforts. Consider an entrepreneur who becomes so obsessed with making their business successful that they lose sight of why they started it in the first place. Their single-minded focus on metrics, growth, and profit margins might lead them to ignore the innovative spirit and customer connection that could actually drive sustainable success. The relentless pursuit of success becomes a barrier to achieving it. This paradox manifests particularly strongly in competitive situations. Athletes who focus too intensely on winning often experience performance anxiety that impairs their abilities. Their desperate desire for victory creates tension, reduces flexibility, and interrupts the natural flow state that typically leads to peak performance. The more they try to force success, the more it eludes them. The implications extend deep into our professional lives. Consider someone so focused on getting promoted that they become rigid, political, and inauthentic in their workplace interactions. Their obvious ambition might actually make others less likely to support their advancement. True leadership often emerges more naturally when people focus on contributing value rather than achieving status. Think about how this plays out in creative fields. Writers who concentrate too heavily on producing a bestseller might find their work becoming formulaic and lifeless. Artists who prioritize commercial success over authentic expression often create work that lacks the very qualities that could make it commercially successful. The pressure to succeed can stifle the creativity that enables success. The success paradox also reveals something profound about human motivation and achievement. Perhaps success isn't something we can pursue directly, but rather a byproduct of engagement, mastery, and genuine contribution. Like happiness, it might come most readily when we're focused on something larger than our own success. Consider how this affects education and learning. Students who fixate on achieving perfect grades might adopt shallow learning strategies that prioritize test performance over deep understanding. Their focus on academic success actually prevents them from developing the genuine mastery that leads to long-term success in their field. This paradox particularly impacts relationship development. People who approach networking with obvious instrumental goals often struggle to build genuine connections. Their transparent focus on what others can do for them creates resistance and mistrust. Real relationship capital often accumulates most quickly when we focus on authentic connection and mutual value. The paradox extends to personal development and life satisfaction. Those who relentlessly chase external markers of success, wealth, status, recognition, might find themselves achieving these goals, but feeling curiously empty. True fulfillment often comes from pursuing meaningful engagement rather than success itself. Think about how this affects innovation and problem solving. Teams so focused on producing successful outcomes might become risk-averse and conventional in their thinking. Real breakthroughs often come when people are free to explore, experiment, and even fail. Precisely the freedom that an intense focus on success tends to eliminate. The success paradox also influences how we approach personal goals. Someone so determined to find a romantic partner that they approach every interaction as a potential relationship opportunity might create pressure that makes genuine connection impossible. Success in relationships often comes when we're comfortable enough with ourselves to stop desperately seeking it. Imagine a society that becomes so focused on preserving its culture that it inadvertently destroys the living essence of what it's trying to save. This is the preservation paradox, where our attempts to maintain traditions exactly as they are can strip them of their ability to evolve and remain relevant. Like a language that becomes dead, precisely because people try to prevent it from changing. Consider a traditional community that, in fear of losing its heritage, creates strict rules about how customs must be practiced. They document every detail, standardize every ritual, and punish any deviation. Yet in doing so, they might freeze these traditions in time, removing the very adaptability that kept them meaningful for generations. The living culture becomes a museum piece, preserved but no longer truly alive. This paradox manifests powerfully in education. Schools trying to preserve classical knowledge might become so rigid in their teaching methods that they fail to engage modern students effectively. The very attempt to transmit traditional wisdom unchanged might prevent students from truly understanding and incorporating these lessons into their lives. The knowledge is preserved, but not truly learned. The implications extend deep into our relationship with history and heritage. Think about historical buildings that become so protected that they can no longer serve any practical purpose. They stand empty and unused, preserved perfectly, but divorced from the community life that once gave them meaning. True preservation might sometimes require allowing structures to adapt to new uses while maintaining their essential character. The preservation paradox reveals something profound about the nature of cultural vitality. Perhaps what makes traditions meaningful isn't their unchanging form, but their ability to remain relevant while maintaining their core essence. Like a river that stays itself by constantly flowing and changing, cultural traditions might need evolution to truly survive. Consider how this plays out in religious practice. Communities that try to maintain their religious traditions without any adaptation to modern life might find younger generations disconnecting entirely. The very rigidity meant to preserve the faith might accelerate its decline. Living religions have historically survived by reinterpreting eternal truths for new contexts. This paradox particularly impacts artistic traditions. When traditional art forms become so codified that innovation is forbidden, they risk becoming sterile and losing their power to move modern audiences. The most successful preservation of artistic traditions often involves allowing new interpretations while maintaining connection to core principles. Think about how this affects language preservation. Efforts to maintain pure versions of languages untainted by modern influences might actually accelerate their decline. Languages survive by adapting to express new realities while maintaining their essential structure. The ability to incorporate new words and concepts keeps them vital and useful. The paradox extends to environmental conservation. Attempts to preserve ecosystems exactly as they are, preventing any change or intervention, might leave them vulnerable to collapse when faced with new environmental challenges. Sometimes, active management and carefully considered adaptation might better serve long-term preservation than absolute non-interference. Consider the implications for personal identity and growth. People who try to preserve their sense of self unchanged might become rigid and unable to adapt to life's challenges. True continuity of identity might require the flexibility to evolve while maintaining core values and characteristics. What if our strongest beliefs are actually our greatest blind spots? This is a conviction paradox, where absolute certainty in our views can prevent us from seeing evidence that might expand or correct our understanding. Like wearing blinders that grow darker the more convinced we become, our strongest convictions might actually limit our ability to perceive reality accurately. Consider a scientist so certain of their theory that they dismiss contradictory evidence. Their very commitment to scientific truth might lead them to behave unscientifically, ignoring data that doesn't fit their preconceptions. The stronger their belief in their theory, the more likely they are to miss the discoveries that could advance their field. Their expertise becomes a barrier to deeper understanding. This paradox manifests particularly powerfully in political and social beliefs. People who are absolutely certain of their ideological positions often become unable to engage meaningfully with opposing viewpoints. Their very passion for justice or truth might prevent them from recognizing valid insights from those who think differently. The strength of their convictions creates intellectual and emotional barriers to deeper understanding. The implications extend deep into our personal relationships. Think about someone so convinced they're a good listener that they never question their communication style. Their very certainty about their interpersonal skills might make them deaf to feedback that could help them connect more deeply with others. Their confidence becomes a barrier to genuine improvement. Consider how this plays out in professional contexts. Leaders who are absolutely certain about their management approach might become rigid and unresponsive to changing circumstances. Their very conviction in their leadership principles might prevent them from adapting when situations require different strategies. Their strength becomes their weakness. The conviction paradox also reveals something profound about the nature of knowledge and understanding. Perhaps true wisdom isn't about achieving absolute certainty, but about maintaining openness to new information while holding provisional beliefs. Like a tree that survives storms by being flexible, our understanding might need to bend to grow stronger. Think about how this affects spiritual and philosophical development. Those most certain about their spiritual beliefs might become closed to experiences that could deepen their faith. Their very devotion might prevent them from encountering the mystery and wonder that makes spiritual life meaningful. Absolute certainty might be the enemy of true spiritual growth. This paradox particularly impacts education and learning. Students who are completely confident in their understanding of a subject might become resistant to information that could expand or challenge their knowledge. Their very mastery of current material might prevent them from reaching higher levels of understanding. Their knowledge becomes a cage rather than a foundation. The paradox extends to cultural understanding. People absolutely certain about their cultural values might become unable to appreciate or learn from other traditions. Their very pride in their heritage might prevent them from engaging in the cultural exchange that could enrich their own tradition. Their cultural strength becomes a form of weakness. Consider the implications for personal growth and development. Someone entirely convinced of their own self-knowledge might become blind to aspects of themselves that need attention or development. Their very self-assurance might prevent them from growing into fuller versions of themselves. Their self-knowledge becomes self-limitation. What if our attempts to create perfect fairness actually result in the deepest forms of injustice? This is the equality paradox, where efforts to establish absolute equality can create new and sometimes more profound forms of inequality. Like a pendulum that swings too far in compensation, our drive for perfect fairness might push us past the point of true justice. Consider a school system that, in pursuit of absolute equality, decides to provide exactly the same education to every student regardless of their individual needs, talents, or challenges. Some students might excel naturally in arts, others in sciences. Some might have learning disabilities, while others might be gifted in specific areas. By treating everyone exactly the same in the name of equality, the system actually creates unequal opportunities for students to develop their potential. True equality might require treating different people differently. This paradox manifests in countless ways across society. Think about workplace policies that mandate identical treatment for all employees, regardless of their unique circumstances. A parent needing flexible hours for childcare might face the same rigid schedule as someone without such responsibilities. The very policies meant to ensure fairness might create situations where some workers face much greater challenges than others in meeting basic job requirements. The implications extend deep into economic policy. Consider universal basic income programs that give everyone the same amount regardless of their cost of living, health needs, or family responsibilities. While seemingly fair on the surface, such absolute equality in distribution might fail to address real differences in need and circumstance. Someone with chronic health conditions or living in an expensive city might struggle far more than others with the same amount. The equality paradox reveals something profound about the nature of justice and fairness. Perhaps true equality isn't about treating everyone identically, but about ensuring everyone has genuine opportunities to thrive according to their own situation and capabilities. Like a garden where different plants need different amounts of water and sunlight, human beings might need different forms of support to flourish. Think about how this plays out in healthcare systems. A hospital that devoted exactly the same resources and attention to every patient, regardless of the severity of their condition, would be failing in its mission to heal. Some patients need more intensive care than others. True equality in healthcare might mean unequal distribution of resources based on medical need. This paradox particularly impacts social programs and welfare systems. Policies that provide identical benefits to all recipients might fail to address the complex web of disadvantages that some people face. A single parent with 3 children might receive the same support as a single person with no dependents. The very standardization meant to ensure fairness might perpetuate or deepen existing inequalities. consider how this affects educational assessment. Standardized tests designed to evaluate everyone fairly might actually favor students from certain cultural or socioeconomic backgrounds who are more familiar with the testing format and content. The very tool meant to measure ability objectively might be measuring privilege instead. True educational equality might require different forms of assessment for different learning styles and backgrounds. The paradox extends to legal systems that strive for equality under the law. Mandatory minimum sentences, for instance, might seem fair by treating all offenders the same, but they can result in deeply unfair outcomes by ignoring important contextual differences between cases. True justice might require considering individual circumstances while maintaining consistent principles. Think about how this affects workplace advancement. Companies that promote based solely on standardized metrics might miss valuable contributions that are harder to measure. An employee who excels at maintaining team morale or mentoring others might be overlooked in favor of someone who produces more quantifiable results. The very systems designed to ensure fair advancement might undervalue important but less measurable forms of contribution. The equality paradox also reveals something important about human diversity. Our differences aren't just superficial variations, but fundamental aspects of who we are. Attempting to achieve equality by ignoring these differences might actually deny people's full humanity. True equality might require celebrating and accommodating diversity rather than trying to eliminate it. Consider how this plays out in international aid and development. Programs that apply identical solutions across different cultures and contexts might fail to address local needs and circumstances effectively. A farming technique that works perfectly in one climate might be useless or harmful in another. Real equality in development might require different approaches for different situations. This paradox has particular relevance for gender equality initiatives. Policies that treat men and women identically might fail to address real biological and social differences that affect their needs and experiences. For instance, maternity leave policies that offer exactly the same benefits to all employees might not adequately address the physical realities of pregnancy and childbirth. True gender equality might require recognizing and accommodating genuine differences while ensuring equal opportunities. The implications extend to cultural preservation efforts. Attempts to give all cultural traditions exactly equal treatment might inadvertently favor majority cultures that are already well established. Minority cultures might need additional support and protection to maintain their practices and traditions. Equal treatment might not result in equal outcomes. Think about how this affects disability rights and accessibility. Providing identical facilities or services to all people might actually exclude those with different abilities or needs. A building with only stairs treats everyone equally, but effectively discriminates against wheelchair users. True equality might require different accommodations for different needs. The equality paradox challenges us to think more deeply about what fairness really means. Perhaps it's not about treating everyone the same, but about ensuring everyone has what they need to participate fully in society. Like a symphony where different instruments play different parts, true harmony might require embracing and supporting our differences rather than trying to eliminate them. Have you ever noticed that the more we try to be unique, the more we end up following patterns of uniqueness that make us similar to others. This is the authenticity paradox, where our conscious efforts to be genuine and original often lead us to adopt behaviors and attitudes that are themselves forms of conformity. Like actors all trying to be natural on stage, our very attempt to be authentic can become a performance. Consider the phenomenon of counterculture movements. People who reject mainstream society often end up creating their own rigid social codes and expectations. A punk rocker rebelling against conformity might find themselves following strict, unwritten rules about how to dress, behave, and think to be authentically punk. Their rebellion against conformity becomes its own form of conformity, complete with its own social pressures and expectations. This paradox manifests particularly strongly in social media, where millions of people simultaneously try to express their unique personalities through standardized formats and filters. Everyone wants to stand out, to be different, to show their authentic selves. Yet this very desire creates patterns of behavior that are remarkably similar. Think about Instagram influencers all posting similar candid shots, or Twitter users adopting similar styles of humor and commentary to appear authentic and relatable. The implications extend deep into personal development and self-discovery. People attending workshops and reading books about finding your authentic self might end up following prescribed paths to authenticity, adopting recommended behaviors and attitudes rather than truly discovering their own way. The very industry built around authenticity might be creating new forms of inauthenticity. Consider how this plays out in creative fields. Artists trying to be original might find themselves unconsciously mimicking established patterns of originality. A writer determined to break all the rules might end up following the well-worn path of the rebel writer. Their very attempt to break free from convention becomes conventional. True originality might emerge more naturally when we're less consciously focused on being original. The authenticity paradox reveals something profound about human nature and identity. Perhaps true authenticity isn't something we can deliberately pursue or achieve through conscious effort. Like happiness, it might be more of a byproduct of engaged living than a direct goal we can aim for. The more we try to be authentic, the more self-conscious and potentially inauthentic we become. Think about how this affects personal style and fashion. People trying to develop their unique personal style often end up following existing alternative fashion trends. Their attempt to express individuality through clothing choices might lead them to adopt looks that are themselves forms of cultural signaling. Even the rejection of fashion trends becomes a trend. This paradox particularly impacts how we present ourselves professionally. The current emphasis on authentic leadership has created new pressures to perform authenticity in specific, culturally approved ways. Leaders might find themselves carefully crafting an image of casualness and spontaneity, their very effort to appear genuine becoming a form of strategic self-presentation. Consider the implications for education and personal growth. Programs promising to help people discover their true selves often guide participants through standardized exercises and experiences. While these might be valuable, the very structure of such programs suggests that authenticity can be achieved through following a predetermined path. The search for uniqueness becomes a shared journey with common landmarks. The paradox extends to how we approach relationships and emotional expression. People trying to be real in their relationships might adopt culturally prescribed notions of what genuine interaction looks like. Their attempt to break free from social scripts might lead them to follow alternative scripts that are equally restrictive. True spontaneity in relationships might require less conscious effort to be authentic. Think about how this affects cultural diversity and expression. Communities trying to maintain their authentic cultural traditions might end up creating fossilized versions of these traditions that lose their living, evolving nature. Their very attempt to preserve authenticity might result in a kind of artificial preservation that misses the dynamic, adaptive quality that made these traditions authentic in the first place. The authenticity paradox also reveals something important about social change and activism. Movements focused on authenticity and individual expression often develop their own conformist pressures. Members might feel compelled to perform their authenticity in ways that are recognized and validated by the group. The very spaces meant to celebrate individuality might end up enforcing new forms of conformity. Consider how this plays out in consumer culture. Marketing increasingly emphasizes authenticity and individuality, creating standardized products and experiences meant to help people express their uniqueness. The very act of purchasing authenticity becomes a commodified experience shared by millions. True individuality might be harder to achieve the more consciously we pursue it through consumption. This paradox has particular relevance in the digital age, where platforms promising to help us express our authentic selves often shape and constrain that expression through their design and features. Social media algorithms might reward certain types of authentic content, creating incentives for people to perform authenticity in platform-approved ways. The implications extend to how we think about personal identity and growth. The very idea that we have a single, authentic self waiting to be discovered might be problematic. Perhaps authenticity is more about accepting our multiple, sometimes contradictory aspects, rather than trying to achieve some idealized version of genuine self-expression. Think about how this affects mental health and well-being. The pressure to be authentic can create new forms of anxiety and self-doubt. People might question whether their thoughts and feelings are genuinely their own or influenced by others, creating a paralyzing self-consciousness. True mental health might require less focus on authenticity and more acceptance of our inherent complexity. What if our quest for perfect knowledge actually prevents us from understanding the deepest truths? This is the knowledge paradox, where our attempts to fully comprehend and categorize everything can blind us to forms of wisdom that defy systematic understanding. Like trying to catch mist in a net, some kinds of knowledge might be graspable only when we stop trying to grasp them directly. Consider a researcher who becomes so focused on gathering data and measuring variables that they miss the larger patterns and meanings in their work. Their very commitment to rigorous methodology might prevent them from seeing connections and insights that can't be captured by their instruments. The more precisely they try to measure everything, the more they might miss what's truly significant, but immeasurable. This paradox manifests particularly powerfully in education systems that emphasize standardized testing and quantifiable outcomes. Schools might become so focused on measuring learning that they neglect forms of development that can't be easily tested. A student's creativity, emotional intelligence, or capacity for complex thinking might be overlooked in favor of easily measurable skills. The very tools designed to assess learning might actually impede deeper forms of understanding. The implications extend deep into how we approach professional expertise. Think about a therapist who becomes so focused on diagnostic criteria and treatment protocols that they lose their ability to connect empathetically with clients. Their very expertise might create a barrier between them and the human experiences they're trying to understand. Sometimes, professional knowledge can obscure personal wisdom. Consider how this plays out in spiritual and philosophical pursuits. People might become so absorbed in studying religious texts or philosophical systems that they miss the direct experiences these traditions point toward. Their intellectual understanding might actually prevent them from accessing the deeper wisdom these teachings are meant to convey. True spiritual insight might require letting go of the very knowledge we've accumulated about spirituality. The knowledge paradox reveals something profound about the nature of understanding itself. Perhaps some forms of knowledge can only emerge when we release our grip on what we think we know, like trying to see a faint star that's only visible when we look slightly away from it. Certain truths might be accessible only through indirect attention. Think about how this affects scientific research. The demand for measurable results and publishable findings might lead researchers away from pursuing questions that don't fit neatly into current methodologies. Important discoveries might be missed because they don't conform to established ways of knowing. Our very methods for acquiring knowledge might limit what we can know. This paradox particularly impacts how we approach personal development and self-knowledge. People might become so focused on analyzing themselves through psychological frameworks or personality types that they lose touch with their direct experience of being. Their accumulated knowledge about themselves might actually create a barrier to genuine self-understanding. Consider the implications for artistic creation and appreciation. Critics and scholars might become so focused on analyzing and categorizing art that they lose their ability to be moved by it directly. Their very expertise might prevent them from experiencing the emotional and spiritual dimensions of art that resist analytical understanding. Sometimes, knowing less might allow us to see more. The paradox extends to how we handle relationships and emotional intelligence. Someone might become so well-versed in relationship psychology and communication techniques that they lose their natural ability to connect with others spontaneously. Their knowledge might create a kind of self-consciousness that interferes with genuine interaction. Think about how this affects cultural understanding. Anthropologists and sociologists might become so focused on categorizing and analyzing cultural phenomena that they miss the lived experience of the cultures they study. Their very methods for understanding might create distance from what they're trying to understand. The knowledge paradox also reveals something important about innovation and creativity. Too much knowledge about how things are done in a field might actually prevent breakthrough thinking. Sometimes, naive questions and fresh perspectives can lead to insights that expertise might blind us to. Consider how this plays out in leadership and management. Leaders might become so well versed in management theory and organizational behavior that they lose touch with the simple human dynamics of working together. Their knowledge might create barriers between them and the people they're trying to lead. This paradox has particular relevance in the age of big data and artificial intelligence. Our ability to collect and analyze vast amounts of information might lead us to overlook forms of understanding that can't be reduced to data points. The very power of our analytical tools might blind us to what they can't measure. The implications extend to how we approach problem solving in complex systems. Experts might become so focused on applying their specialized knowledge that they miss simple solutions or obvious connections. Sometimes, knowing too much about how things should work can prevent us from seeing how they actually do work. Think about how this affects medical practice. Doctors might become so focused on test results and diagnostic criteria that they lose their ability to see the whole patient. Their very expertise might prevent them from noticing subtle signs or making intuitive connections that could lead to better treatment. What if our desire to achieve perfect freedom actually leads to its own form of imprisonment? This is the freedom paradox, where our relentless pursuit of absolute liberty can create new and sometimes more restrictive forms of constraint. Like a bird that flies so high, seeking freedom, that it can no longer find enough oxygen to breathe, our quest for unlimited freedom might lead us into unexpected forms of captivity. Consider someone who rejects all forms of commitment in the name of personal freedom. They avoid long-term relationships, refuse steady employment, and reject any form of routine or obligation. Yet in doing so, they might find themselves imprisoned by their very dedication to remaining free. Their relationships remain superficial, their work lacks depth and progression, and their life misses the rich experiences that come from deeper engagement. Their freedom becomes a kind of cage. This paradox manifests particularly powerfully in modern consumer culture. We're offered endless choices in every aspect of life: careers, relationships, lifestyles, identities. This abundance of options seems to promise ultimate freedom. Yet, many people find themselves paralyzed by choice, unable to commit to any path for fear of limiting their options. Their theoretical freedom becomes a practical imprisonment in indecision. The implications extend deep into how we structure our lives and societies. Consider social media platforms that promise unlimited freedom of expression. Users can say anything, be anyone, connect with everyone. Yet this very freedom often leads to anxiety, addiction, and social pressure to maintain certain online personas. The freedom to express ourselves constantly can become an obligation to do so. Think about how this plays out in economic systems. Free market ideologies promise liberation through unlimited economic choice and opportunity. Yet unrestrained markets often create new forms of economic bondage: debt, wage slavery, environmental degradation that limits future choices. The very freedom of the market might generate its own forms of constraint. The freedom paradox reveals something profound about human nature and fulfillment. Perhaps meaningful freedom isn't about having no constraints, but about choosing the right ones. Like a musical instrument that makes music only because its strings are held under tension, human life might find its richest expression within certain limitations. Consider how this affects creative work. Artists who reject all forms and conventions in the name of absolute creative freedom might find themselves producing work that's less meaningful or impactful than those who master and then thoughtfully break traditional forms. Complete freedom from artistic constraints might actually limit creative possibility. This paradox particularly impacts personal development and identity formation. People who insist on keeping all options open, refusing to define themselves or commit to any particular path, might end up with a fragmented sense of self. Their very resistance to limitation might prevent them from developing depth and expertise in any area. The implications extend to how we approach education and learning. Students given complete freedom to study whatever interests them without any structure or requirements might actually learn less than those working within thoughtful constraints. Some form of structure often proves essential for meaningful learning and growth. Think about how this affects romantic relationships. People who maintain absolute freedom to leave relationships at any time, refusing to build deeper commitments, might find themselves unable to experience the profound intimacy that comes from choosing to limit one's options. Their insistence on keeping all possibilities open might close off the possibility of genuine love. The freedom paradox also reveals something important about professional development. Workers who prioritize absolute flexibility and independence might miss opportunities for growth that come from committing to organizations or long-term projects. Their resistance to any form of professional constraint might actually constrain their career development. Consider how this plays out in political systems. Societies that emphasize absolute individual freedom often end up requiring more rules and regulations to prevent chaos and protect individual rights. The very pursuit of maximum liberty might necessitate more complex systems of control and restriction. This paradox has particular relevance in the digital age, where technology promises to free us from physical and temporal constraints. Yet our devices and platforms often create new forms of dependency and limitation. The freedom to work anywhere becomes the obligation to work everywhere. The freedom to always be connected becomes the inability to disconnect. The implications extend to how we think about personal growth and authenticity. The pressure to be completely free and autonomous individuals might actually prevent us from acknowledging our fundamental interconnectedness and need for community. Our very pursuit of individual freedom might cut us off from essential sources of meaning and support. Think about how this affects mental health and emotional well-being. People who reject all forms of emotional constraint or social convention in the name of personal freedom might find themselves struggling with anxiety and instability. Some form of emotional and behavioral structure often proves essential for psychological health. The freedom paradox also influences how we approach parenting and child development. Parents who avoid setting any limits in an attempt to give their children complete freedom might actually impede their children's development of self-regulation and capability. Some thoughtful constraints often prove essential for healthy growth and learning. What if our desire to understand ourselves perfectly actually prevents us from knowing who we truly are? This is the identity paradox, where our relentless self-examination and attempts at self-definition can create artificial versions of ourselves that obscure our authentic nature. Like trying to see your own eyes directly without a mirror, the very act of intense self-observation might distort what we're trying to observe. Consider someone who becomes obsessed with understanding their own personality. They take every personality test, read every self-help book, and constantly analyze their own behavior. Yet this very intensity of self-focus might make them more self-conscious and less natural in their actions. Their efforts to know themselves completely might actually create a more artificial version of who they are. This paradox manifests particularly powerfully in social media, where people carefully curate their online identities. In trying to present their authentic selves, they often create highly edited versions of their lives. The more they try to show who they really are, the more they might end up performing a role rather than living naturally. Their pursuit of authentic self-presentation leads to increasing artificiality. The implications extend deep into how we approach personal growth and development. Think about people who become so focused on self-improvement that they lose touch with their natural inclinations and desires. Their constant effort to become their best selves might prevent them from accepting and expressing who they actually are. The very tools meant to enhance self-knowledge might create distance from genuine self-experience. Consider how this plays out in professional life. People might become so focused on developing their personal brand or professional identity that they lose touch with their natural strengths and authentic work style. Their effort to present a perfect professional image might actually impede their ability to work effectively and connect genuinely with colleagues. The identity paradox reveals something profound about human consciousness and self-awareness. Perhaps true self-knowledge isn't something we can achieve through direct observation and analysis. Like trying to catch your own shadow, the harder you chase it, the more it eludes you. Understanding might come more readily through indirect means, through engagement with others, through action rather than analysis. Think about how this affects psychological therapy and counseling. People might become so absorbed in analyzing their past experiences and emotional patterns that they create new layers of self-consciousness that actually impede natural healing and growth. Sometimes, less self-focus might lead to more genuine change. This paradox particularly impacts artistic expression and creativity. Artists who become too conscious of developing their unique style or voice might end up producing work that feels forced or artificial. Their very effort to express their authentic creative identity might prevent the natural emergence of their distinctive artistic voice. The implications extend to how we handle relationships and social connections. People who constantly analyze their social interactions and try to optimize their relationship skills might become less spontaneous and genuine in their connections with others. Their very effort to be better at relationships might make them less naturally relatable. Consider how this plays out in cultural identity. People attempting to connect with their cultural heritage might become so focused on performing authentic cultural practices that they miss the natural, evolving nature of cultural identity. Their very effort to be culturally authentic might lead to a kind of artificial performance of culture. The identity paradox also reveals something important about learning and skill development. Students who become too self-conscious about their learning process might actually impede their natural ability to absorb and integrate new knowledge. Sometimes, less self-awareness might lead to more effective learning. Think about how this affects leadership development. Leaders who become too focused on cultivating their leadership identity, might lose the natural authority and influence that comes from authentic engagement with their work and teams. Their very effort to be better leaders might make them less effective at leading. This paradox has particular relevance in the age of personal data and self-tracking. People might become so absorbed in measuring and analyzing every aspect of their lives that they lose touch with their intuitive sense of well-being and natural rhythms. The very tools meant to enhance self-knowledge might create alienation from direct experience. The implications extend to how we think about personal history and memory. People who become too focused on constructing a coherent narrative of their lives might actually distort their memories and experiences to fit their desired self-image. Their very effort to understand their life story might lead them away from the messy truth of their lived experience. Consider how this affects spiritual and philosophical seeking. People might become so focused on achieving enlightenment or wisdom that they create new forms of ego and self-absorption. Their very pursuit of transcendence might reinforce the self-consciousness they're trying to overcome. What if the greatest paradox of all is our endless search for final answers in a universe that thrives on questions? This is the ultimate paradox, where our deepest understanding might come not from resolving paradoxes, but from learning to live within them, like waves in the ocean that never reach a final destination, but create the very essence of the sea through their eternal motion. Perhaps life's contradictions are not problems to be solved, but dynamics to be embraced. Consider how, throughout our journey through these paradoxes, each attempt to find absolute resolution has led to new questions, new mysteries, new contradictions. The more deeply we've explored, the more we've discovered that paradox isn't an obstacle to understanding, but a gateway to deeper wisdom. Our very desire for perfect clarity might be what prevents us from seeing the beauty in life's inherent ambiguity. This final paradox manifests in every aspect of human experience. Think about love. The more we try to define it precisely, the more it escapes our definitions. Yet in accepting its mysterious nature, we might experience it more fully. The same applies to consciousness, creativity, meaning, and purpose. Perhaps these fundamental aspects of existence resist final explanation, precisely because their indefinable nature is what makes them profound. The implications extend into how we approach knowledge itself. Throughout history, every major breakthrough in understanding has revealed new levels of mystery. Einstein's revelations about space and time didn't simplify our universe. They showed us how much stranger it was than we had imagined. Quantum physics didn't resolve all questions about the nature of reality. It showed us that uncertainty is built into the fabric of existence. Consider how this plays out in personal growth and development. The more we learn about ourselves, the more we realize how much remains unknown. Each insight reveals new depths to explore. Perhaps true wisdom lies not in achieving perfect self-knowledge, but in becoming comfortable with our own complexity and continuing evolution. The ultimate paradox reveals something profound about the nature of existence itself. Maybe the universe isn't a puzzle to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. Like a piece of music whose beauty lies not in reaching a final note, but in the journey through all the notes, life's meaning might emerge not from finding ultimate answers, but from engaging fully with its questions. Think about how this affects our approach to happiness and fulfillment. Our search for perfect contentment often leads to discontent, while accepting life's inherent uncertainty might bring unexpected peace. Perhaps true happiness isn't a destination but a way of traveling, not an answer, but a way of questioning. This paradox particularly impacts how we think about time and existence. We're finite beings trying to comprehend infinity, temporal creatures attempting to understand eternity. Our very limitations might be what gives our existence its meaning and beauty. Like a painting that becomes art precisely because it has boundaries, our finite nature might be what makes our experience profound. The implications extend to social and cultural life. Every attempt to create perfect systems, political, economic, social, has revealed new complications and contradictions. Perhaps the most stable societies are those that learn to work with paradox rather than trying to eliminate it, that build flexibility and adaptation into their structures rather than seeking rigid perfection. Consider how this affects our relationship with technology and progress. Each solution we create generates new challenges. Each problem we solve reveals new problems to address. Yet this very dynamic might be what drives human innovation and creativity. The endless dance between problem and solution, question and answer, might be the engine of human advancement. The ultimate paradox also reveals something important about consciousness and awareness. Our minds seek patterns, explanations, resolutions, yet consciousness itself remains one of the greatest mysteries we face. Perhaps our ability to wonder, to question, to live within paradox is what defines our humanity more than our ability to find answers. Think about how this affects our approach to ethics and morality. The more we try to create absolute rules for right and wrong, the more we encounter situations that defy simple categorization. Perhaps true moral wisdom lies not in having perfect principles, but in developing the capacity to navigate complexity with compassion and understanding. This final paradox has particular relevance in our current age of information and connectivity. We have more access to knowledge than ever before, yet in many ways, we feel more uncertain about what we know. This very tension might be pointing us toward a new way of understanding, one that embraces complexity rather than trying to eliminate it. The implications extend to how we think about the future of human development. Every advance in human knowledge and capability seems to reveal new challenges and responsibilities. Perhaps this endless unfolding of new questions is not a bug, but a feature of existence, not something to overcome, but something to embrace as the very essence of life. Consider how this affects our relationship with meaning and purpose. The very search for ultimate meaning might be what prevents us from experiencing the meaning that emerges naturally from engaged living. Like trying to grab a handful of water, the harder we grasp for final answers, the more they slip through our fingers. Up next, you've got two more standout theory right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.